To the 2011-2012 Academic Convocation. It is my privilege to introduce this next piece that will be performed by the Fenway Quintet. The tradition of institutional composers writing new music for special events goes back at least to the Middle Ages. Dr. Tom Schnauber, Associate Professor of Performing Arts, had the privilege of continuing in that tradition by writing this work for Sister Janet Eisner's celebration of her 30 years as Emmanuel College's president. In this piece, a bright, festive fanfare is followed by a hymn in the classical church style. The melody of the hymn rhythmically matches the lyrics to the Emmanuel College alma mater. time, I ask that you please join me in standing for the opening prayer. O Holy One, grant peace, goodness, and blessing, loving kindness and mercy to us and all your people. On this day of academic beginnings, grant guidance and knowledge to faculty, staff, and students. Inspire us all together with the light of your wisdom. Breathe into us your spirit of life and an understanding of what is right and good. May we become doers of just deeds, champions of compassion, men and women of tempered and informed intellect, inspired by your love to serve others. And on this day, we thank you for leading us to this place at this time in our lives. We offer our gratitude in the name of all that is holy and sacred. Amen. It is now my pleasure to introduce the president of Emmanuel, Sister Janet Eisner.
Thank you, Jordan. And thank you, Dr. Tom Schnauber, that amazing introduction, that fanfare. Let's give him another round of applause. It certainly is a great joy to welcome you to this academic convocation and the opening of our 93rd academic year. As you know, convocation is an important tradition which dates back to the earliest years of Emmanuel. Let me first recognize and welcome our students. I invite the class of 2012, our senior class, to please stand. You don your graduation robes for the celebration of the Mass of the Holy Spirit last evening, and now you wear them today. You will wear these again in October at your cap and gown ceremony, where you will be formally invested in the final stage of the baccalaureate. Welcome. I welcome the members of the junior class 2013. You are now our upperclassmen. The sophomore class, the class of 2014, you are now preparing in this year to declare your interest in a particular area of study. And I welcome again the class of 2015, our freshman class, whom we greeted last evening at the Mass of the Holy Spirit. And we welcome all our students from our graduate and professional programs, our dedicated faculty, administrators, and staff. Colleges hold convocations at the beginning of the academic year to convene the entire college community to remember and reflect on their mission or aspects of their mission. This year, 2011-2012, I call this college community to engage in mission-based planning throughout the academic year. As we move forward in this second decade of the 21st century, Emmanuel has just experienced a decade of amazing transformation and is now called to shape the vision for the future of Emmanuel. Through a series of conversations and knowledge-based discussions across the college, faculty, students, administrators, and staff, we hope to renew our understanding of mission and develop a shared vision for Emmanuel's future. By the end of this second semester, we hope to have created a dynamic strategic plan for Emmanuel's next 5 years. To do this well, we need the full participation of each member of the college community. So watch and listen for information on how to participate in charting our future. It now gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Joyce DeLeo, our new Vice President of Academic Affairs. An outstanding leader, scholar, and teacher, Dr. DeLeo came to Emmanuel in August from Dartmouth Medical School, where she served most recently as chair of the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology and was professor of neurology at Dartmouth Medical Center. She also served as director of the Neuroscience Center at Dartmouth. Those of you, which I think is a lot of people here, who have met her know that she brings great energy and commitment to Emmanuel. Dr. DeLeo will offer a few remarks, and then we'll introduce Dr. Ray Devatir, our keynote speaker. Dr. DeLeo.
Thank you very much, Sister Janet. Good afternoon. Welcome to the class of 2015, our upper classes, our faculty, staff, and friends to the start of this new academic year. I would like to begin with a quote from Elie Wiesel that opens the freshman book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, that I will come back to in a few moments. We must not see any person as an abstraction. Instead, we must see in every person a universe with its own secrets, with its own treasures, with its own sources of anguish, and with some measures of triumph. This academic year is a new beginning for me because I am also on a journey of intellectual, social, and spiritual growth in this very distinctive environment that is Emmanuel. You, the incoming class of 2015, will always hold a special place for me since we are both new to this college and campus and beginning our journey together. Last spring, when I was interviewing here, I kept seeing the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, on everyone's desk. I took this as a sign, since this book had a major impact on me when I read it last year, well before even considering the Vice President of Academic Affairs position here at Emmanuel. Even though this story takes place over 50 years ago, this book touched me deeply, both as a scientist and a person. As a scientist, I had worked with HeLa cells, among many human cell lines, and I never imagined where these cells came from. Some of the freshmen, I think, partook in Joe Kurtz's demonstration of these live cells. I never imagined that the label HeLa was based on the name of a poor tobacco farmer, Henrietta Lacks. Nor had I considered that these cells were taken without her or her family's knowledge or consent. This book highlights how race, gender, and disease can interact to produce enormous human vulnerability. As I read this book, I reflected on my own scientific research. I began to rethink how my lab procured human cells, the ethics of informed consent, and the prevailing racial and economic divides in our society. My lab uses brain tumor cells from patients undergoing brain surgery to study the role of glial cells, a major cell population in the brain, in the role of glioblastoma multiforme, a very dire form of brain cancer. Our current practice is for the neurosurgeon to ask the patient prior to surgery whether he or she consents to allowing a sample of her tumor cells to be taken for further scientific research. In my case, just back to our lab, which is just a hallway away. After reading Skloot's book, I questioned whether my ambition for science, similar to George Guy's, the scientist at Johns Hopkins who first cultured Henrietta's cells, clouded my reasoning in our present approach. Are the patients under duress when asked for their consent? Do they have adequate knowledge to understand what will happen to their cells? Are they afraid if they say no, that the surgeon may not perform the operation as well as possible to remove that aggressive, infiltrating tumor that is growing in their brain? In the book, Mary Kubitschek, George Guy's lab assistant, takes part in the autopsy of Henrietta Lacks several months after they had obtained those cells. She had never seen a dead body. When Mary's gaze falls on Henrietta's feet, she gasps. Henrietta's toenails were covered in chipped, bright red polish. Many years later, she tells Rebecca Skloot, "When I saw those toenails, I nearly fainted. I thought, oh geez, she's a real person." I started imagining her sitting in her bathroom painting those toenails, and it hit me for the first time that those cells we'd been working with all this time and sending all over the world, they came from a live woman. I'd never thought of it that way. Mary had never considered the person who provided those highly proliferative cells, nor had I prior to reading this book. I now will always respect and appreciate that there's a person behind the sample that arrives on ice to our lab door. Early in the book, I was appalled to learn that Henrietta Lacks experienced uncontrolled pain after her diagnosis of cervical cancer. For the past 2 decades, my laboratory has studied what may cause chronic pain, and how this common problem may be better addressed to reduce the associated suffering that accompanies pain. Our primary objective in this research is to find new drug targets that also act on glial cells, that do not produce untoward side effects, like addiction. This is a problem that's a potential risk with any painkiller, such as morphine. Many studies have shown that certain racial and ethnic groups continue to receive inadequate pain management even today in 2011. Why is this? Why have we not achieved parity in treating patients regardless of their race, ethnicity, or social status? Henrietta Lacks grew up in Clover, Virginia, which was only about 12 miles from the local lynch tree. The Ku Klux Klan held meetings less than 10 miles from Clover's Main Street until well into the 1980s. There is no way to know whether Henrietta's treatment would have been different if she was white. Skloot's book certainly provokes us to ask the question. Deborah, Henrietta's daughter, tells the author that her mother's cells has done so much for the medical program, but we cannot afford medical care. How is it that this enormous problem remains as a barrier more than 50 years later? There are many lessons we can take away from Rebecca Skloot's book that center around ethical, racial, gender, medical, and social issues that play major roles in our society today. The immortal life of Henrietta Lacks is not a story that lives in the past, but one that should shape our lives and our future. Again, Elie Wiesel's quote captures the meaning of this inspiring work. We must not see any person as an abstraction. Instead, we must see in every person a universe with its own secrets, with its own treasures, with its own sources of anguish, and with some measures of triumph. What sets Emmanuel apart? I believe it is our mission: to educate students in a dynamic learning community rooted in the liberal arts and sciences and shaped by strong ethical values in a Catholic academic tradition. Wiesel's words reflect an important challenge for us today, but doing as he suggests is how we can live out our mission as a college. Roland Patillo, a professor at Morehouse University, speaks to the author Rebecca Skloot on how she should approach Deborah, Henrietta's daughter, for her research. Don't be aggressive. Do be honest. Don't try to force her into anything. Don't talk down to her. Do be compassionate, and do have patience. We all would like to be treated this way, and we should all aspire to treat others in the same manner. Now, as you begin your experience here at Emmanuel, to the incoming freshmen, I ask you and all upper classes to actively engage in something that doesn't seem right. Be the one in the group that questions the ethics. Be the critical thinker. Be the leader. Grow not only intellectually, but consider your role as a person in this college, in this amazing city, and in the larger community. How will you make a difference? Remember Henrietta Lacks' courage, her immortalized cells, which you actually saw in the auditorium last week, and how you have made a difference if you were as the physician or the scientist using and growing her cells in those flasks and incubators. One of the main reasons I came to Emmanuel is to interact with students and be a part of a vibrant learning community. Become a vital part of that community yourself by reaching out to me, to our faculty, to our staff, and your fellow students. We wish to get to know you because it is you who inspire us. Over this academic year, I encourage you to connect with me and share your experiences in the classroom, in the community, and in your lives. When you see me in the cafeteria, please say hello and have lunch with me. I look forward to an exciting and fulfilling year together. I wish you all the very best. Thank you. Thank you. Another reason I was attracted to Emmanuel is the quality and passion of our faculty that I experienced in the interview process and since I've come in August. One of these faculty members is Professor Raymond Devatier, PhD, Professor of Philosophy, and Director of our Values-Based Education program. In planning this convocation, we sought to celebrate one of our own faculty who is a scholar and leader in bioethics. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Raymond Devatier. Ray has been at Emmanuel College as a philosophy teacher for over 40 years. He is an internationally recognized philosopher specializing in ethics and healthcare, bioethics, and moral reasoning. His accomplishments in this field are well known by the medical community in the greater Boston area, where he serves on ethics committees and institutional review boards for the protection of human participants in research. I look forward to hearing Ray's insights on this book with you. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leo, for your introduction. Sister Janet, members of the administration, colleagues on the faculty, staff, students, especially the seniors, the class of 2012, and the entering class, the class of 2015. In the 20 or 25 minutes that I've been asked to say a few words, I would like to try to contribute something to a conversation that's already well begun here at Emmanuel on the HeLa cells and the tragic life of Henrietta Lacks. And I hope it will be thought-provoking and enable all of us to continue the conversation. Before I do, I probably should say a word about Henrietta Lacks' tragic life, because I asked my class on healthcare ethics, bioethics, which is a 2000 level course, and therefore there were no freshmen in the class, if they had read the book, and only 2 out of about 35 students knew what I was talking about or had even looked at the book. So a few moments of background so we'll all get somewhat on the same page. Henrietta Lacks was born in 1920, and her name was Loretta Pleasant, because that was Pleasant was the name of her parents. Now, when she was 4 years old, the first great tragedy struck. Her mother died, giving birth to the 10th child in the family. So she had 9 siblings. Her father was unable and unwilling to care for her, so he divided up the children among friends and relatives, and she was separated from all her brothers and sisters and went to live with her grandfather, who lived in a 4-room house, log cabin with no indoor plumbing, an outhouse in the back, and no running water. He was already raising one of her cousins, whom her mother's sister had brought into the world after a brief fling with somebody passing through the area. The father of the child left, and the mother was unable or unwilling to raise the cousin, so David was living in the house. And she and David moved into one of the 4 rooms, as the grandfather did his best to bring them up. And when she was 13, she became pregnant, and David was the father. Another great tragedy. She delivered her first child, and his name was Lawrence Lacks, and he's still alive today. A few years later, still a teenager, she had a second child, a child named Elsie Pleasant. And the second child probably was fathered by another cousin called Crazy Joe. And Elsie had numerous problems, both physical and emotional and mental, including epilepsy. When she was 20, she married her cousin David. And shortly thereafter, with the defense industry building up in 1941 and 42, at the beginning of World War II, she and her husband moved to Baltimore and subsequently had 3 more children, 5 in all. Her health wasn't the greatest during these years, and we now know that while still in her 20s, she suffered from gonorrhea, syphilis, and also some of the HPV viruses, specifically HPV-18, which is known to have a relationship with cervical cancer in women. In 1951, some medical problems brought her to the free clinic at Johns Hopkins. That clinic was established by the hospital for people who couldn't pay, poor people, regardless of their race or ethnic background. But in the 1950s, the clinics were segregated. There were clinics, there were wards for the black people and wards for the white people. But nonetheless, they received the treatment that one could offer at Johns Hopkins. An examination and a biopsy showed another tragedy in her life. She had cervical cancer, and she's about 31 years old and has 5 children. A few days later, she's at the hospital for what was state-of-the-art treatment at that time, which everybody, rich or poor, received for cervical cancer. Radium was sewed up against her cervix in the hope that the radiation would kill the cancer cells. But before doing that, the doctors took 2 more biopsies, one of healthy cervical tissue and the other of the malignant tissue, and sent them to George Guy's laboratory. He had been collecting cells at Johns Hopkins for decades, hundreds and hundreds of them. He was desperately trying to grow cells in his laboratory in order to do medical research that would save lives and cure disease. Those cells became one of just another sample, but the next day they noticed in the test tube they had doubled, and the new cells looked as robust as the original ones. And the next day it doubled again and again and again. And finally, for the first time, a human cell line was immortal, and it's still going on today. And from those original cells, that small biopsy of that tumor, because the healthy cells died, the small biopsy of that tumor, over 50 metric tons of HeLa cells are produced in the world, and they're still continuing today. Within a few months, her name now became Henrietta Lacks. Even though she was born Loretta Pleasant, she took the name of her grandfather Lacks. No one knows how she got the name Henrietta, at least in the family, but she was dead within a few months and buried in an unmarked grave. If you read some of the blogs, and if you read some of the commentary on what happened to her, there is the suggestion that the scientists and the doctors at Johns Hopkins were racist. It's a controversial issue. But before going any further, I would just like to read a brief quote from Dorothy, her daughter, who is the woman in the family that Rebecca Sklootz became close with. At one point, she quotes Dorothy as saying the following, quote, "Everybody always yelling, racism, racism. That white man stole that black woman's cells. That white man killed that black woman. That's crazy talk. We all black and white and everything else. This isn't a race thing." End of quote. Racism is in the background of the story of Henrietta Lacks. The segregation in Clover, where she was brought up, the segregation of the schools, Brown versus the Board of Education hadn't occurred yet. The idea that separate but equal was fine, the old Plessy Ferguson phrase. There was segregation in the wards at Johns Hopkins. There is no question that African Americans received substandard care in many cases. But the scientists interested in the cells, it's hard to say there was racism involved in that. They just wanted human cells, and many of them didn't have a clue where they came from. I would like to raise a few questions now that emerge from the book for our own reflection and critical thinking. The first 4 I call settled questions, and I have 3 more that I don't think are settled, and then I have a final question which I call the big question, which brings us where we want to be, I think, in this academic convocation and what we do here at Emmanuel. First settled question as far as bioethicists and the legal commons is concerned. Was it moral, was it right for the doctors to take those second 2 biopsies without asking her? They weren't for her benefit. They were for George Guy's lab, for the research that doctors were doing to try to get cells to grow in a laboratory so that you can see the impact of various things on cells. Was that moral? And we've clearly known in both ethics and law for more than 30 years now, that's immoral, that's unethical. You don't take biopsies from people from research without their informed and voluntary consent. The second settled question also involving Henrietta Lacks. It's a question of privacy and her medical record. As her name became known some years later, people began publishing in Rolling Stone and elsewhere about her. And finally, there was a book published in 1975 by a respectable press, an academic press, the State University of New York Press. And this book gave long excerpts from her medical record. Was it moral for somebody, person unknown, but somebody at Johns Hopkins, to give to this author excerpts from her medical record? Was it moral, was it ethical for the State University of New York Press to publish that book? We now know for 30 years the answer to that, both ethically and legally, it was not. You can still buy that book, by the way. Check Amazon.com. The title is The Conspiracy of Cells. The third settled ethical question: what about her daughter Elsie? She tried very hard, Henrietta did, to take care of her, but she had many, many problems. And finally, sadly, she had to institutionalize her in a state hospital that was segregated. It was known formally as the Hospital for the Negro Insane. The name at the time that Elsie went there was Crownsville. The conditions were deplorable. But doctors there were trying to do their science. They were trying to help people, and in one great study of epilepsy, this was the experiment on Henrietta's daughter Elsie. They were trying to get good x-rays of the brain in the late 1940s, and that was hard to do. We didn't have MRIs, we didn't have PET scans or CAT scans or anything like that. And one of the things that was interfering with clear x-rays was the fluid that surrounds the brain. That seemed to be clouding the x-rays. Let's see if we can get better x-rays, especially with children that have epilepsy. We'll go to Crownsville. 100 children. Let's drain the fluid that surrounds their brains and pump air into their skulls. And we got better x-rays. And for months, those children suffered because it was painful and caused headaches and other problems. They suffered until the body was able to reproduce the fluid that surrounded the brain. They didn't ask the parents' permission, and even if they had asked permission and consent from parents, we now know today in this third question, that was horrendously immoral. And we have in place now special provisions to protect those who have not yet reached their 18th birthday, who in law are defined as minors, so that they will not be abused in medical research. There were other experiments too. 100 children, and inevitably Elsie, who had epilepsy, and that's what they were studying, must have been one of them. And Dorothy, when she found out her sister was a victim of this, was shocked, as we all should be shocked. There's a fourth settled ethical question that we know the answer to, and it involves in the 1970s when researchers wanted to track down the contamination of laboratory cell lines with various other cell lines, most notably Henrietta the HeLa cells. So they wanted to come back to the family, to the father and to the children that were there. They wanted to come back to the family and get their blood, and then looking at the genetic makeup of their blood, they would be able to tell which cell lines had been truly contaminated with HeLa cells. And so the researchers instructed a postdoc fellow, a Dr. Susan Sue, to call up the family and get their consent to draw blood that they could examine. So she called them up and talked to David, their father, Henrietta's widowed husband, and talked to him. And she explained when Rebecca Sklutz went back and talked to Dr. Sue, she said, no, I explained it all to him. That was informed consent. I made it very clear. I talked about genetic profile. I talked about HLA antigens, and I believe he understood. I don't know how he got confused. Because David thought that the blood test was a cancer test to see if any of the children had the cancer that killed their mother. Short time later, they went to the three of the four surviving children. The fourth one, unfortunately, was serving time in prison at this time. Two of Henrietta's children ended up in prison, one for second-degree murder and the other one for drug dealing. They went back to the three children, and when Dr. Sue explained to them what the blood draw was all about, they all got the same impression. We're being tested for cancer because our mother had cancer, and they're trying to see if we have it so that they can try to cure it. And that wasn't it at all. They wanted the blood for research. So was the blood draw unethical and immoral? We now know clearly that it was. Researchers have an obligation to make sure that people who are involved in their research protocols know what's going on. And we shouldn't be surprised David Lax got it all wrong. David Lax, the father of the children, was listening to a doctor who was born in China and spoke English with a Chinese accent, and David Lax got as far as halfway through the 4th grade in the 1920s. Do you think he knew a lot about genetics and HLA antigens and so forth? There's not a chance that he or even members of his family who graduated from high school could really understand what this is all about. Well, as far as bioethics is concerned, those 4 questions have been settled for many years and have been settled in the law. These were horrible things and should not have happened. But I have 3 other questions that the book suggests, and these aren't settled, and these aren't settling. And so all of us, adults, students, becoming adults, should be concerned with, because it's the culture that we live in. The first of these is the question of who should control our cells once they're outside our bodies. Who should control them? And we don't know the answer. We don't know whether we should have some control over them or the people who take them, presumably with our permission, should have some control over them. And whether we know it or not, there's lots of cells outside of our bodies. Every time we have a biopsy, every time you have surgery, if you're at a teaching hospital, there was probably a consent form that said this is a teaching hospital and your tissues, your cells may be used for teaching and research, and we signed the consent form. They're gone. We donated them. And those of you, especially in the class of 2015, 14 maybe, who were born in Massachusetts, your cells are outside your body. They're stored in state laboratories. Because when you were born, your heel was nicked, and drops of blood were taken and put on a card, and you were tested for dozens of genetic diseases that wouldn't show in the baby, but will show up in tests. You were screened. And some states destroy those blood spots 6 months or a year after you have had this newborn testing performed. Massachusetts does not. And everybody born in the last 20 years or so, the blood is stored in laboratories. It's used for screening, and it probably can be used for research, whether your parents know it or not. Because the way it's set up in Massachusetts, and there are some ethical issues with this, unless your parents read the form carefully and checked the box that opted out of research. They can't opt out of the screening. That's required by law. But unless they check the box that you opt out of research, your blood's available for research for anything and everything in the future. You've lost control over it. The idea of who controls cells outside of our body, that's one of the big questions that's unsettled. And today we know those cells have tremendous amount of information in them all your genetic information and lots of genetic information about your parents and your brothers and your sisters and the rest of your family. And so it becomes crucially important, this issue of control, that we try to get it resolved. We making any progress? Not really. Rebecca Sklootz talks about the case of John Moore, the man who in 1975 went to UCLA with cancer of the spleen, and he signed the usual form, and they took his spleen out and started working with his cancer cells, which, by the way, are immortal, just like Henrietta's. You could write a book, The Immortal Life of John Moore, because his cell line is also immortal. He found out that his doctor and UCLA were making big money out of these cells, because in recent decades, biotechnology has become very profitable for some people. He says, hey, those are my cells. I ought to get a piece of the action. Oh, no. They're ours. We control them. So he sued. And on the appellate level in California, he won. UCLA appealed to the Supreme Court of California, and he lost in 1990. He appealed again to the United States Supreme Court. They said, no, thank you. We're not going to touch this. And they declined to hear the case. Another famous case, and there's only 3 cases. The second one was in Miami Children's Hospital. There were researchers doing research to try to find a test for Canavan disease, an inherited recessive genetic disorder that affects children, terrible disease. Most children die before they're 4 years old. And Dr. Catalan there at Miami Children's Hospital is doing research, and he asked the parents of children who had Canavan disease to get their cells for genetic analysis. He wanted to develop a test for Canavan and eventually, hopefully, to find a cure. So they put the cells in this cell depository. They found out a few years later that Dr. Canavan and the Children's Hospital are making really big bucks because they have found a prenatal test for Canavan disease, a carrier test for Canavan disease, and they have a patent on it, so they control it, and the patent enables them to make all the profits from the study. So they sued, and the court said, no. You lost it. Your cells, but you've lost control. The final case is even more interesting that's been to court. It's only the 3rd one in 2007. The case at Washington University in St. Louis of Dr. Catalona, a famous researcher, a researcher in prostate cancer, the man who developed the PSA test for prostate cancer. He had thousands of samples from his patients. He would ask them, I'm going to do a biopsy in your prostate. Can I keep the cells? Sure. I want to do research on them. Then he got an offer to move from Washington University to Northwestern University in Chicago, and he wanted to take thousands of those cells with him to his new laboratory. And Washington University said, like heck you are. They're ours. And he says, no, my patients gave them to me, which they did. He even got thousands of his patients to write a letter to Washington University. Dear Washington University, it's not an exact quote. I gave my cells to Dr. Catalona, and now I want him to take those cells with him. They're his. I gave them to him. And Washington University got very nervous and went to court and said, we want the court to determine who owns those cells. And the court did. Washington University owns the cells. The good doctor was on their payroll. They were stored in the university's laboratory. He doesn't even control them anymore, and the patients don't control them. They gave them away. But, and this will show you the complexity of bioethics at times, the case also said, if those people want their cells destroyed, they can have them destroyed. What's going on here? First of all, it seems like the cells are property. If you give property to someone, it's theirs. You can't go back and retrieve it, but you can get it destroyed. Because there's another train of thought, that if we give ourselves to research, that's a continuation of ourselves. And so we are really research subjects. We are participants in research. And federal law says if you participate in a research protocol, you can get out any time you want. And we tell everybody who's going into research this. And so by analogy, the court argued if your cells are being used in research, you can get them anytime you want. But you're not going to take your cancer cells from your prostate and put them back in your body. So the court solved it by saying you can destroy them, but you can't get them back and give them to Dr. Catalona to take with him to his new laboratory. And that case was decided a few years ago and shows some of the confusion in thought, because we don't know what to do on the issue of who controls the cells outside of our body. It's too new. It's cutting edge. And so as you come here to Emmanuel and study and learn about some of these cutting edge things, you'll be in a much better position to enter the conversation as we try to work through things. It would be wrong, I think, to say there's no right answer. I'd rather we say there is a right answer. We don't know it yet. Maybe you'll help us find it. A second unsettled question is, and if you read the blogs, you'll see a tendency to say this: should Henrietta's family get money from the HeLa cells? They're making some people a lot of money. In the beginning, not so. George Guy made no money, Johns Hopkins made no money from it, but now biotechnology has it and they're being sold and people are making a profit and shareholders are benefiting. And it seems counterintuitive because this family is still on the edge of poverty, still has inadequate health care. So how can people make big money off the HeLa cells, from the HeLa cells, and they're still doing so poor? So there's kind of a move to say that morally they should be paid. But that is a very difficult thing to establish. When you take the cells, you don't know if they're worth anything. George Guy's laboratory had taken cells from hundreds and hundreds of people, and they were almost all worthless. No one knew that Henrietta's cells were going to be worth anything, and he didn't even know it he never made $1 on it for the first few years. And how long should the compensation trail go? Should the compensation be for the children and for the grandchildren? And how do you catch up with people? Because today, many of the cell banks are anonymous. So trying to compensate people for their cells has a huge logistic problem and maybe should not occur. Hospital right next door to us, Beth Israel, for example, for years has a contract. People sign the usual informed consent for biopsies and surgeries. It's right in there. All the leftover stuff that used to be medical waste, all of that is collected and sent to a company in Lexington, which is compiling a huge data bank from Beth Israel, from Duke, and a few other places, Maine Medical Center, a huge biobank that people can access it's a for-profit company. So all of these cells are making profit for somebody, but not the people who gave the cells. So that's a big issue, the issue of compensation. So there's a few questions that we haven't resolved. It doesn't seem quite fair that if you have cells that make a lot of money, that you don't get any of the money. But on the other hand, there is another side to the story that we have to keep in mind as we try to find the right answer. A third unsettled question: how should we try to approach these unsettled questions? There are basically two options. One of the options is a philosophy of rights, property rights. As John Locke said, the three basic human rights are natural rights, are the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to property. It's my property. I own my body. I own my cells. And so it should be by right that I have control over them, because it's my stuff. It's my property. And also, still a rights-based framework, if there's research, I, as a research subject, have a right to withdraw from research for any reason or no reason, whenever I wish. So I have a right to have the researchers go in their laboratories and say, destroy my cells, I don't want them used anymore. I suppose that Henrietta's family would have a right to go around and say, no more using HeLa cells, we withdraw them from research. And that, of course, would be a disaster for medical research. So that's one framework, a rights-based framework. Lately, some ethicists, including a well-known ethicist at Johns Hopkins, Ruth Fadden, who's the head of the ethics program there, and others have been proposing what seems to me a better approach. An approach very consistent with the tradition of this college, an approach based on the common good. Let's not emphasize rights and rights to property, and maybe therefore I can make a buck with my cells if things turn out well and I'm lucky and have really great cancer cells that people want. Perhaps we should think of the common good and what we can do for each other. And do what we do in blood drives, donate our blood, which people take and sell. Insurance companies eventually pay for that when it's used. Maybe we should think of the common good and how we're all united, and how our cells, after all, were a gift to us. We did nothing to earn them. Mommy and Daddy gave them to us. That is part of the human genetic heritage that we can contribute to making life better by donating our cells and not worrying about property rights. And so, doctor, if you can find something useful, fine. Just protect my confidentiality, my identity, because my genetic identity is wrapped up in those cells. And today, most of the cells used in research are anonymized. They're made anonymous. They're scrubbed of names. It's impossible to trace them back where they came from. And those are the cells that researchers are working with. And it's a big-time kind of an enterprise. So as we think about how to approach the unsettled questions, we should be aware that there are two main approaches at work. And depending which one we take, we'll come down on one side or the other about the control of our cells and whether or not there should be compensation to people whose cells happen to make a lot of money. A final question, and I think the big question: how the hell could all of this have happened? This is only the tip of the iceberg. Anybody who's read about the history of research in our country cannot but become sickened. The research at Willowbrook, where doctors are trying to develop a vaccine for hepatitis, and every time they thought they were close in this state hospital, they took children in, and then they injected them with the vaccine. Does it work? I don't know. Let's inject them with hepatitis. And if they get it, we know the vaccine doesn't work. The famous Tuskegee syphilis study, which is also mentioned in the book. A horrendous and ugly, immoral thing that went on for decades. The doctors never saw it. The scientists never saw it. The reporters blew the whistle. Finally, when Peter Buxton, who worked for the U.S. Department of Public Health and the CDC, finally, when his superiors wouldn't listen, went to the New York Times and revealed it, and it hit the front pages. Everybody who read the paper could see what was wrong with it, but not the researchers. What happens? How could these things have gone on? The research at Crownsville, how could it have gone on for so long? The radiation studies that came to light a few years ago, people at prestigious universities, University of Chicago, injecting dying patients with plutonium to see what happens. Researchers at Mass General injecting dying patients with uranium to see what happens. These are human beings. They're sick, they're dying, they might be poor, but they're human beings. Respect for persons totally lost and totally missing. We're trying to prevent that kind of thinking, that kind of moral blindness, that lack of moral awareness from ever happening again. And that's why we stress value-based education at Emmanuel. We hope our faculty and students will raise the value questions, the moral questions in their science courses, behavioral science as well as biological science, but also across the curriculum. The moral questions that emerge in history, that emerge in literature, that emerge in economics, that emerge in business and in education and in management and in political science and in information technology and so forth. They're loaded with value questions, moral implications. The point of a value-based education, which I hope you hear more of in your years here, is simply to prevent moral blindness, to overcome a lack of moral awareness that can affect all of us, and become sensitive to what the researchers and scientists in the 50s and 60s, bent on doing good, bent on finding cures, bent on doing great science, never saw. Good people with good intentions often do terrible things. With value-based education, we hope that we can kind of prevent that from happening at least as much as it has happened in the future. Thanks very much. Have a good day.
I'd now like to open it up for questions from anyone in the audience. We have a few moments for Ray or for myself.
As a fellow ethicist, I appreciate and share your concern for the real-world impact of these ideas and for preventing moral blindness in ourselves and others. And I wonder what you think the impact of this book about Henrietta Lacks will be along those lines. This has been a bestseller. It's getting a wide reading. Do you think it will have an effect on the ethics conversation, on the culture of biomedical research, or on our broader society in any significant way?
Well, I certainly hope it will, and I think it's already had a tremendous impact and a tremendous effect. And I'm not sure who chose it for the freshman class to read, but you did. Okay. Well done. I suspected that, but I wasn't sure. And I do think it has a great potential. One of the things is it's caught the attention of many people outside of the ethicist, the ordinary person, and also I think, and Joyce may want to comment on this, many scientists.
I think it has really affected the scientific community because now we have a fictional book, or it started to be, just a fiction, but it's really a true story. So without having that line that we know it actually happened, I think we didn't have a basis, and now we can at least draw from the book and do things better. Any other questions?
You gave a few examples on how science could be very unethical. But I have a question. When is science ever completely ethical?
Your question is, when is science ever completely ethical? I think, given the religious tradition I come from, I think, to put it in theological terms, it's kind of healthy for all of us to be aware that we're all sinners. Nothing personal. You may be the great exception. No, but what I mean is, I think it's a question that's interesting, that we're always fighting against evil sometimes that we don't see, and we should be aware that not only in the religious tradition, but in traditions of people like Freud, that there's a dark side to humanity. And there is a strong side with a great will for life and a good life, but there's also a drive for thanatos and for death, and that's destructive, and that to be human is to be involved in that great struggle, and none of us, while we're alive, ever succeed in completely succeeding in that particular struggle. So I'd have to say that I prefaced it, my conclusion is science ever 100% ethical? No, but nothing is ever 100% ethical. It's a great struggle that we're all involved in, and the best we can hope for, I think, is to do better and better. I don't know.
I would love to talk more about it with you, especially as being a scientist. So just to see, how I can add to it in a much deeper discussion.
It's almost like asking, is the student body ever 100% ethical? Or the faculty? We try.
Any other questions
For Ray, our speaker? Okay, well, I just want to thank everyone for attending, and also that we have a reception following the ceremony in the Fenway Room, and we're going to end our ceremony singing the alma mater, led by Tim Evans and the quintet and our Emmanuel Community Choir.
Wow.